I think would be really helpful is to break down each of these. I think the O and the O are a little bit more challenging versus the decide and act, right? Decide, you have to make a decision. Act, you have to take the action. But the difference between observe and orient, and what are some maybe questions we need to ask ourselves? How can we do the best we can to orient ourselves, to observe and then orient and put ourselves in the best decision making place.
So let's just think about the Air Force colonel that came up with this is John Burns. Is that right, Rich? I think it's John Burns that came up with it. So you think about it in terms of they were fighter pilots is why they came up with it. You think about it in terms of that, it's all about what you see, right? It's what you're seeing. Now in our lives, it's what we're seeing, but a lot of times it's also what we're hearing. So I think one of those challenges that sales reps in general, people in general have is their active listening skills. John Boyd, thank you. Thanks, Lindsay. Their active listening skills may not be there. So the observation piece breaks down and there's really no ability to orient or decide based on what you observe because you actually missed some cues, whether they're verbal or physical. So Sandler talks a lot about the communication pie chart and how we all make decisions early in an interaction. And 55% of what we're looking at is visual. It's physical cues. And that's allowing us to make judgments based on what we're seeing with interactions that we have with people. In a virtual selling world, if we have our cameras on, that can still be true, but it also will boil down to what we hear. So I often think that active listening skill is overlooked on the observation piece of the OODA loop, right? So curious, either one, can you give me an example of that? In a situation, how do we miss some of those things from a listening perspective?
I've got one recent example in coaching with a client of mine and debriefing their experience with one of their prospects. One of the things that we could miss is not necessarily what the individual says, but what is the intent behind what they say, and are we making assumptions? And so the prompt that came from his prospect in particular was, how are you different than the 3 other folks that I've had conversations with this week, in so many words? And my client, because he understands how they're different, proceeded to answer the question. But what he didn't understand was, what does different mean to this individual? So that could have been step 1 in terms of observation and orienting. When they say different as compared to what? Okay. So that would give us a little bit more clarity in terms of how we can then decide and act based upon that particular question.
You know what's really cool about that, Rich, is this is obviously a self-serving statement, but if you don't have a sales methodology, right, the observation part, that means you have no orientation because you're not following any system. That would be like Buford not knowing that the high ground was important. Mm-hmm. So if we have an orientation, that basically means that there's a North Star. Okay. If you're listening, but there's no North Star, what the hell are you doing? You're not doing anything. So in this case, if we know that mutual mystification is an issue, or we need to get it back to compared to what, right? Like what makes you different, and we don't know the compared to what part, then we're going to have a problem, right? So that's the big question. Okay, so let's move to orientation. If we're not following a system, then we're just going to spend our lives following somebody else's, right? So in the Sandler world, orientation, when we get that, is what? What do we want to do, right? What you just said. That's what we want to do. Reverse them. Cool. Because let's go to orientate. I think we just kind of hit it a little bit, but when we're getting an orientation, it has to be compared to what our process is, what our best practice is, what our North Star is, right? So without that, there's there is no orientation because you're just floating around in the ether with no direction.
Yeah, I would agree.